Hello and welcome back to Lineup Breakdown, where I analyze the big winning lineups from last week's NFL action. And the two winning lineups, the winning lineup at FanDuel and their Sunday Million, and the winning lineup for the DraftKings Millionaire Maker for Week 15, are actually quite different. There are only three overlapping players, and three players from one team that featured on FanDuel Sunday or not. No players from the team featured. With that in mind, to jump into these very different lineups. So went past the building blocks of these teams. There were multiple avenues to case sometimes, and starting off 18 winning at the FanDuel Sunday was a Broncos-powered offense led by Brock Osweiler at 0.4% ownership. He was just $6,700 and facing the Steelers. And while the point spread heading into the game and the fact that the Broncos were facing a white-hot Steelers offense suggested that maybe they would be in a hole early and playing catch-up, that didn't actually turn out to be the case. The Broncos were the ones that raced out to a big lead, and it was the Steelers that played catch-up. They got off to that big lead thanks to Osweiler coming out clicking on all cylinders, posting a perfect quarterback rating in the first quarter of the game, erupting for almost 300 passing yards in the game overall, 296 to be exact, added 19 yards rushing, but did a lot of damage by finding the end zone, 3 touchdown passes, and added another on the ground. That's over 30 fantasy points at under $7,000 at under 1% ownership. So really a very game-changing pick right out of the gates for Dank 18's winning roster. Moving on to running back, they, like me, judging by the team build, you would think felt that the Steelers would race out to a big lead and it would be the Broncos playing catch-up. D'Angelo Williams was on this roster, and you typically don't take a running back if you're expecting that team to be playing catch-up. Game flow would pretty much crush a back in that. And D'Angelo Williams has been an effective pass-catching back this year for the Steelers, but with just a half point per reception at FanDuel, got to think that the game didn't exactly go as Dank 18 expected, but turned out to work out just fine with this roster build. As you can see, I mean, they won the tournament, so that's obviously quite good. But D'Angelo Williams was 10.1% owned at $7,000. Didn't put in a big effort. Totaled just 56 yards from scrimmage, but did catch 5 passes and did reach the end zone. So managed to save the day and reach double digits in points, and wasn't enough to cost this team the top of the standings. The other back also helped push this team to the top of the standings, and at 31.2% ownership was very chalky. David, little did his most ardent supporters realize just how great a play he was this past week. He went nuts. He reached the end zone 3 times, rushed for 100, also added 4 receptions for 42 yards receiving. Chris Johnson looked adequate in this offense earlier in the year, but even if he's healthy for the Super Bowl, and the Cardinals get that far, this is David Johnson's backfield now. The man looks awesome in that backfield. He's a well-rounded back who can do damage on the ground, do damage through the air, has a nose for the end zone, and that touchdown run that he had where he broke probably half dozen tackles was remarkable. If you haven't seen it yet, just watch NFL Network or ESPN's any of the NFL programs on there this week. You'll see it over and over again, and for good reason. Any end-of-the-year highlight reel shows are going to have that as well. Moving out of receiver and moving back to that Broncos-Steelers tilt in Pittsburgh for Week 15. Got Emmanuel Sanders on this roster, checking in at 0.8% ownership. Cheap-ish price at $7,100. This cheap relative to these stud receivers. Sanders had been really slumping hard, not on the same page as Osweiler. In the 2 weeks prior that the two had played together, they did have one big showing against the New England Patriots, but Sanders got back in the good gracious fantasy community, at least for those who used him and owned him this week, going off for 10 receptions for 181 yards and a touchdown, added 24 yards rushing as well against his former team. For those who bought into the revenge narrative, I mean, good for you if you like the matchup, which is the better process for picking players. But if you love that matchup with the soft Steelers corners, congratulations into his talent against a really bad secondary. You were rewarded handsomely. If you trusted as much as Dank18 did, then you were rewarded even more handsomely, because that stack, that Broncos stack, wasn't a 2-player stack. It was a 3-player stack, also featuring Demaryius Thomas, another low-owned player, 4.3% ownership rate. And even though he didn't post a gaudy reception or receiving yard total with 5 and 61 respectively, he did reach the end zone 2 times. In all, that's better than 20 fantasy points at receiver, and you'll take that every day of the week. And the big score at receiver this week for every team that used him was the matchup-proof Antonio Brown. All of the eyes seem to be on Odell Beckham Jr. against Josh Norman. I'm somewhat guilty of pumping up that matchup, but I will give myself a figurative pat on the back and say that I also did bring this Antonio Brown matchup up in the GPP article for those who read that going into the weekend. He was facing a very stout secondary, but it did not matter. And no one outside of Richard Sherman's good showing against Brown has had an answer for Brown when Big Ben's been healthy. Brown went off this past week. He had 16 receptions for 189 yards and 2 touchdowns on 18 targets. That's just remarkable efficiency. He and Big Ben are very much on the same page, and he did all this on 7% ownership. Don't expect to see an under 10% ownership rate for Antonio Brown anytime soon. Won't see it again the rest of this season. Probably won't see it early next season as long as he and Big Ben are healthy. The two are just unstoppable when the two are playing together. Brown is just, without question, the best receiver in the NFL. Moving on to tight end, the position didn't provide a ton of big scores, but the chalk did reach the end zone. And Rob Gronkowski reached the end zone. Greg Olsen reached the end zone. But Jordan Reed outperformed both. He reached the end zone twice, totaled 84 yards receiving on 7 catches against the Bills. Bills have really not had much of an answer for tight ends of late, and Jordan Reed continued their slide defending them. It was a chalk play at 16.6%, but he did pay off, and he was not that expensive, at least compared to Gronk and Olsen. So not only did you get a better fantasy scoring output if you used Reed, you also got some savings moving down from Rob Gronkowski and Greg Olsen. At kicker, Jason Myers didn't really do a heck of a lot, scored 6 points, but thankfully for Dank18, that wasn't enough to derail this team from winning the FanDuel Sunday Million. Finally, the defense that rounded this group out was the New England Patriots, and if you looked at the numbers going into this one, this shouldn't come as a complete shocker that they had a big game against the Titans. They were big favorites at home. They put the Titans in predictable passing situations. The Titans have had problems protecting the quarterback. The New England Patriots have gotten after the quarterback. As a result, the Patriots recorded 5 sacks when they predictably raced out to a big lead, and the Titans were stuck throwing the ball. They also forced 3 turnovers, and that one of which resulted in a defensive touchdown. And by holding the Titans to 16 points scoring, they ended up turning in 18 fantasy points for this winning roster. And anytime you can approach 20 fantasy points with your defense, you're getting a nice edge on the competition. Moving on to the DraftKings Millionaire Maker winning roster that was put together by C. Flanders 002. We got a different quarterback at the top, and boy, you couldn't have hit any harder than Cam Newton this week, especially at DraftKings, where you get bonuses for yardage. Cam gave you not 1, but he gave you 2 bonuses. He threw for 340 yards passing, which was good for the 300-plus passing yard bonus, and he rushed for 100 yards on the nose, good for the 100-plus yard rushing bonus there as well. He did fumble, but I'd say more than made up for that with the yardage and 5 more touchdown passes. Absolutely carved up the pathetic Giants secondary, and basically is doing everything he can to cement his MVP case. 48.6 fantasy points. Anytime you're at half a hundo, you're doing pretty darn good. Cam Newton pretty darn close to that. Another big score was David Johnson, who, like helping the FanDuel Sunday Millions roster, helped this one. A little less chalky at DraftKings, 28.6% ownership rate, so under 30%, but plenty chalky and once again delivered as well. Also got that yardage bonus plus the full point per reception. In all, another player flirting with 50 fantasy points, 47.9 in all. One of the diamonds in the rough on this team was Danny Wood, had 2.1% ownership, netted 36 fantasy points at just $4,200 against the Dolphins. Dolphins have been noted for giving up fantasy points to running backs this year, but most of that's been on the ground. Danny Woodhead did most of his work through the air, had 6 receptions that alone netted him 6 points thanks to the full points per reception, but he did a heck of a lot more than that. Total 50 yards receiving, reached the end zone 3 times through the air, added 10 more yards and another rushing score on the ground. 36 points in all. What a monster showing. Headlining for this group was Antonio Brown, one of the carryovers from the other roster. All those receptions resulted in a full point at DraftKings as opposed to the half point at FanDuel, plus the yardage bonus. Brown, almost exactly 50 fantasy points on the nose, just a little bit short, 49.9 fantasy points. So 3 players that netted almost 50 fantasy points, plus Danny Woodhead. In all, that quartet of players accounted for 66.86% of this team's fantasy scoring. So to say that the 4 horsemen, I guess you could say, of this fantasy squad did most of the damage, would be an understatement. They just put in huge work, and the rest of the roster was filled in with some nice plays like Ted Ginn Jr. at wide receiver too. $4,600, so a nice bargain play. Good option to stack with Cam. He's targeted often, and the speedy receiver dropped a surefire touchdown pass. But you know what? He made up for it, reeled in a half dozen grabs for 85 yards and a pair of scores. So even with another ugly drop for Ted Ginn Jr. this past week, he still netted 26.5 fantasy points. His volume of work and his ability to get behind the secondary and continue to get targets from Cam Newton makes him a fairly decent stacking option with Cam Newton, especially in GPPs where you're chasing ceiling and you can take that chance on him maybe flopping, which he's done at times. A guy who has not flopped often this year and turned in a down game by his standards, but was once again a scorer in the fantasy teens. Allen Robinson caught another touchdown pass, his 13th touchdown reception of the season. He only caught 3 passes for 57 yards, but that touchdown was enough to get him into the teens and enough to keep this team headed in the right direction and eventually landing the top spot at the top of the DraftKings Millionaire Maker. At tight end, Jordan Reed's a carryover from the other roster, so I won't go into too much depth here other than to say that he was a little bit lower owned in the DraftKings Millionaire Maker than in the FanDuel Sunday Million, so even more edge gained in this competition at 9.9% ownership. At flex, this team featured a minimum salary Dontrell Inman in what was a very hot Chargers passing attack in what could be their last game in San Diego. Inman delivered 3 receptions for 78 yards, no touchdowns, not a big showing, but 10.8 fantasy points at min salary was enough. He was a glue guy. He allowed some serious salary relief that allowed for spending up on Brown and Jordan Reed and Cam Newton and some other big ticket items that helped push this team to the top of the standings. Finally, the team was rounded out by the Houston Texans defense and special teams. They were 14.2% owned, so a little bit more popular than I expected, but probably should have expected them to be around this ownership rate given their $2,500 salary. Matt Hasselbeck continues to be in a bit of a tailspin here late in the season. Over 40 years old at quarterback. It was going to be tough for him to maintain his early season success filling in for Andrew Luck, and the offense just couldn't get it going against the Texans. They mustered just 10 points. Texans recorded 3 sacks and forced 2 turnovers. In all, they scored 11 points, which is plenty good enough at $2,500 to justify that expenditure on this roster, and was another glue roster spot, much like that Dontrell Inman one that kept this team together and complemented the monster scores, the quartet at the top. And that's going to wrap things up for this week's lineup breakdown analysis of the big winning lineups for Week 15. Check out all of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com this week. We've got articles, we've got video podcasts to help you win again in Week 16. Also help you out in your NBA contests, your college basketball contests, your NHL contests, and your college football contests. No shortage of content at dailyfantasycafe.com. Get on there and check that out. And until next week, Good luck in your daily fantasy sports games.